Harrenhal is the largest castle ever built in the history of Westeros, and it is also the most cursed. Harren the Black spent 40 years constructing it, pulling workers from across the Riverlands, draining resources from an entire kingdom, and building towers so tall they scraped the cloud. The moment it was finished, Aegon Targaryen arrived with his dragons and melted it from the inside out. Harren and every single one of his sons died in those burning towers on the very night he moved in. That should have been the sign. That should have been when everyone looked at those blackened, twisted spires and said absolutely not. Instead, house after house tried to rule Harrenhal, and house after house was destroyed for doing so. This is the story of every family that held the cursed seat of the Riverlands, and what happened to each of them. House Hoare built Harrenhal, and House Hoare died in it. That's really the summary of their entire legacy. But the fuller story is genuinely fascinating, because the Hoares were one of the most powerful dynasties in Westeros before that single night changed everything. The Hoares were Ironborn, which is important context because they weren't supposed to be ruling the Riverlands at all. The Iron Islands and the Riverlands are completely different in culture, geography, and tradition. The Ironborn lie by the old way, raiding and reaving, and taking what the sea god gives them. The Riverlanders are river people, farmers and traders and fishermen who built their civilization around the endless waterways of central Westeros. These two cultures should never have been joined under one ruler, and the fact that they were explains a lot about why Harren the Black became so extreme. House Hoare came to rule the Riverlands through generations of conquest. Earlier Hoare kings had pushed inland from the sea, expanding iron authority over the green lands of the Trident. By the time Harren inherited, he ruled from the Neck all the way to the Blackwater Rush, controlling more territory than any other king in Westeros at that moment. He had the most men, the most resources, and the most ambition. He decided to build a castle that would make his legacy immortal. The construction of Harrenhal consumed his kingdom. 40 years of labor, tens of thousands of workers, many of them slaves or thralls forced into service under Hoare rule. The towers were built so massive that the sheer weight of stone required foundations dug deeper than any castle in history. The walls were raised so thick that conventional siege weapons were meaningless against them. Harren was building something that was supposed to be unconquerable, a monument to Ironborn power planted in the heart of Westeros. He finished it the same year Aegon Targaryen landed at what would become King's Landing. The timing was catastrophic in a way that feels almost supernatural. Every Riverlander house that had suffered under Hoare rule immediately rose up and joined Aegon's invasion. The people Harren had been exploiting for generations became Aegon's army, and then there were the dragons. Harren locked himself and his sons inside Harrenhal's walls, confident that stone could stop anything. He was right about conventional weapons. He was completely wrong about dragonfire. Balerion the Black Dread heated the walls themselves until the stone melted, flowing down the towers like candle wax. The iron and the stone became actual rivers of molten metal. The towers twisted and fused into the warped shapes they still hold today. Harren and all his sons burned to ash inside towers they never got to enjoy. House Hoare was completely extinguished that night. No heirs, no branches, no continuation. The family that spent 40 years building an eternal monument to their dynasty ended on the same day they moved in. The curse of Harrenhal arguably began with them because they killed so many people building it, worked so many into the ground and threw their bodies into the foundations that the castle was soaked in death before it ever housed a living lord. Aegon Targaryen needed someone to actually rule the Riverlands and manage Harrenhal after the conquest. He granted it to Qoherys, the master-at-arms of Dragonstone, who had been with the Targaryens before they even began the conquest. This should have been a reward for loyalty. It became a death sentence for an entire family. House Qoherys was not a particularly ancient or prestigious house going into this arrangement. They were Valyrian in origin, minor nobility associated with Dragonstone before the doom of Valyria, which meant they had Targaryen connections but not much independent power or wealth. Being granted Harrenhal was supposed to elevate them into one of the great houses of the new kingdom. The seat was enormous. The lands were rich. The strategic position controlling the God's Eye was genuinely valuable. Qoherys died relatively quickly into his tenure. The details of exactly how and why he died are somewhat murky in the historical record, but the castle's reputation was already forming around this first death. His son or grandson continued the Qoherys line at Harrenhal, but the family was clearly struggling. They couldn't fill the castle with enough men to properly garrison it. They couldn't generate enough income to maintain the massive structure. The scale of Harrenhal works against any lord trying to hold it, because the upkeep is astronomical, and the space requires thousands of servants and soldiers to function. The Qoherys line died out within a generation or two of receiving the castle. The specifics vary in different accounts, but the result is the same. A family elevated by royal favor to rule the greatest castle in Westeros was simply gone, leaving no heirs and no continuation. The first house to rule Harrenhal after the conquest failed to survive even the earliest decades of the Targaryen dynasty. This established the pattern that would repeat across centuries. The castle looks like a prize but functions like a trap. Its size makes it impossible to maintain without extraordinary resources. Its history makes the local population view its lords with a mix of resentment and fear. And something about the place seems to drain the luck and longevity from whoever tries to rule it. House Harroway came to Harrenhal through royal connection rather than military service, and their end came through royal politics rather than warfare, which makes their story uniquely brutal even by Westerosi standard. Lord Lucas Harroway held Harrenhal during the reign of Maegor the Cruel, which is already a terrible context for any story. Maegor was the second Targaryen king, son of Aegon the Conqueror, and he ruled through absolute terror and violence. The Harroway connection to the crown was that Lucas Harroway's daughter Alice became one of Maegor's wives. This was theoretically a path to security and influence. It turned into a catastrophe. The problem was that none of Maegor's wives were producing healthy heirs. The king had married multiple women in an attempt to continue the Targaryen line, which was controversial enough since the Faith of the Seven only recognized one wife. When Alis Harroway gave birth to a child that Maegor found unsatisfactory, a stillborn or deformed infant by different accounts, the king's reaction was not grief. It was rage and suspicion. Maegor concluded that the Harroways had somehow betrayed him. His logic may have been that Alis had been unfaithful, or that the family had used sorcery, or simply that he needed someone to blame for his failure to produce heirs. The reasoning didn't really matter because the conclusion was predetermined. He destroyed House Harroway completely and utterly. Lord Lucas was killed. Alis was killed. Every Harroway relative that Maegor's men could identify was hunted down and executed. The house wasn't defeated in battle or stripped of titles through legal process. It was simply massacred, removed from existence by royal decree and violence. Harrenhal passed on again to another house, and another family learned that holding the cursed castle meant exposure to the most dangerous political forces in the kingdom. The Harroway story shows a different dimension of the Harrenhal curse. The castle doesn't always kill through external attack or internal collapse. Sometimes holding it puts you in proximity to power, and proximity to power in Westeros can be the most dangerous position of all. House Towers held Harrenhal briefly in the aftermath of the Harroway destruction, filling the vacuum left by Maegor's massacre. They are among the least documented of Harrenhal's ruling houses, which itself says something about how quickly and completely they disappeared from the historical record. What is known is that House Towers received the castle and lands during the later part of Maegor's reign, or the very beginning of Jaehaerys I's reign, the old king whose long and largely peaceful rule followed Maegor's terror. They did not last. The family died out or was removed from Harrenhal quickly enough that chroniclers didn't record much detail about their tenure. This near invisibility in the records is its own kind of tragedy. House Towers briefly held the greatest castle in Westeros and left almost no mark on history. They weren't destroyed in any dramatic or memorable way that historians felt compelled to document. They simply ceased to be a going concern at Harrenhal, another family ground up by the castle's impossible demands and the political environment surrounding it. The pattern with these early Targaryen-era houses is that none of them were powerful enough to hold Harrenhal properly. Aegon and his successors kept granting it to houses that couldn't sustain it, either because those houses lacked the resources, lacked the numbers, or lacked the political insulation necessary to survive at such an exposed and prominent seat. Each failure confirmed the growing reputation of the castle as a place that destroyed its lords. House Lothston is where the Harrenhal story gets genuinely dark in ways that go beyond simple political misfortune. The Lothstons ruled the castle for an extended period compared to their predecessors, lasting from sometime in the early Targaryen era into the late reign of Aegon IV. Their longevity might seem like a break in the curse, but the way they finally fell and what they apparently became during their tenure suggests the castle found other ways to corrupt them. The Lothstons were notable enough to be considered a significant noble house during their time. They held Harrenhal for multiple generations, which none of the previous houses had managed. They served as loyal Targaryen vassals through several reigns, and seemed to have finally solved the problem of ruling the cursed seat. Lady Danelle Lothston was a prominent member of the court at King's Landing, and was known to have connections to various powerful figures of her time. Then the stories about the Lothstons start getting very strange. The accounts from the later period of their rule describe practices at Harrenhal that range from eccentric to genuinely horrifying depending on which source you read. There are tales of Lady Danelle Lothston engaging in dark arts, of rituals being performed in the castle, of children disappearing from the surrounding villages. The Lothstons in these accounts become something like monsters living in a monster's castle, which is exactly the kind of story that attaches to a place like Harrenhal. How much of this is literal truth versus the reputation enhancement that naturally accumulates around a cursed and feared location is impossible to determine at this distance. What is documented is that the Lothstons lost Harrenhal and were destroyed as a house. The details of exactly how and why are disputed, but the end result was another complete extinction of a ruling family. House Lothston no longer existed when their tenure ended. If the darker stories have any truth, then the Lothstons represent a variation on the Harrenhal curse, where the castle doesn't just kill its lords, but corrupts them first. The isolation of Harrenhal, its overwhelming scale, its bloody history, its reputation might genuinely affect the psychology of people who live there long enough. The Lothstons may have gone mad in the castle rather than simply being destroyed by it. House Strong represents one of the most tragic Harrenhal stories because they seemed like they might actually succeed. They were powerful, well-connected, politically sophisticated, and they held the castle during a period when they had genuine influence over the realm's direction. Then they were destroyed not by war or extinction, but by scandal and murder. Their downfall connected directly to the most explosive political crisis of the early Targaryen period. Lord Lionel Strong held Harrenhal during the reign of Viserys I, the king whose indecision about succession planted the seeds of the Dance of the Dragon. Lionel Strong was the Hand of the King, the second most powerful position in the realm, serving Viserys with distinction and managing the realm's affairs competently. His sons were prominent figures at court. Harwin Strong served as commander of the Gold Cloaks in King's Landing, and became known for his great physical strength, earning the nickname Breakbones. His other son Larys was a quieter figure, a man with a clubfoot who preferred whispers to sword. The problem was Harwin Strong and Princess Rhaenyra Targaryen. The rumors that circulated about their relationship were the kind that destroyed dynasty. Rhaenyra was married to Laenor Velaryon and had produced 3 sons, but those sons had brown hair and strong features, while Laenor was silver-haired and slender. Harwin Strong had brown hair and was famously strong. The implication was obvious to everyone at court, and discussed openly enough to become a genuine political crisis. Harwin and Lionel were both sent away from King's Landing to Harrenhal as a way of managing the scandal. It should have been a period of quiet exile that let the situation cool down. Instead, there was a fire at Harrenhal that killed both of them, Harwin and his father Lionel, in one night. The fire was almost certainly not accidental. Larry Strong, the surviving son still at court, was later revealed to have arranged the killing. His motive appears to have been entirely self-interested, removing his father and brother to inherit the Harrenhal seat himself, while also potentially doing a favor for enemies of Rhaenyra who wanted her suspected supporters eliminated. Larys became one of the most dangerous political operators of the entire Targaryen dynasty, serving as master of whisperers and manipulating events across decades. But how Strong effectively ended with Harwin and Lionel's deaths. Larys never had legitimate children and was eventually executed. The family that had briefly reached the height of power as Hand of the King was gone within a single generation of holding Harrenhal. House Whent is perhaps the most famous of Harrenhal's ruling houses, simply because their tenure coincides with the events that directly triggered Robert's Rebellion and the end of Targaryen rule over the Seven Kingdoms. They didn't cause the rebellion, but their home was where the spark was struck. The Whents held Harrenhal for a substantial period before the events of Robert's Rebellion, making them one of the longer-lasting ruling families the castle had seen. They were loyal Targaryen vassals in the Riverlands, a house of middling prominence elevated by possession of Harrenhal into something approaching major status. Lord Walter Whent's most consequential act was hosting a great tournament at Harrenhal in 281 AC, the year of the false spring. This tournament is one of the most discussed events in recent Westerosi history because of what happened there. Crowned as the greatest tournament of a generation, it drew every major house in the realm. Rhaegar Targaryen won the tournament and then, in full view of the entire assembled nobility, passed over his own wife and placed a crown of winter roses on Lyanna Stark's head as Queen of Love and Beauty. The implications of that gesture caused immediate political damage and longer-term catastrophe. Lyanna was betrothed to Robert Baratheon. Her brother Brandon Stark was present. The message everyone read into Rhaegar's action was that he had publicly declared his feelings for another man's betrothed in front of thousands of witnesses. Whether or not the interpretation was correct, the symbolism was impossible to walk back. What followed is the history everyone knows. Rhaegar abducted or eloped with Lyanna, depending on which version of events you believe. Brandon Stark rode to King's Landing to demand justice and was killed by the Mad King along with his father. Robert's rebellion began. The Targaryen dynasty ended. Hundreds of thousands of people died. All of it can trace a line back to that moment at Harrenhal when Rhaegar placed those roses. Whent survived the rebellion, but barely. The family dwindled dramatically in the immediate aftermath. By the time the events of the main series begin, the house was nearly extinct. Lady Shella. Whent was the last known Whent in Harrenhal when Tywin Lannister marched his army to the castle and simply took it, leaving her with nothing. The Whents illustrate that sometimes the Harrenhal curse works slowly. They held the castle, they hosted the event that broke the world, and then they faded into near-nothingness over the following years. The castle didn't kill them dramatically. It just used them as the instrument of a catastrophe and then discarded them. During the War of the Five Kings, Harrenhal passed through several hands so rapidly that it became almost a symbol of how quickly power can shift. Tywin Lannister seized it from the Whents, using it as his base for operations in the Riverlands against Robb Stark's forces. Tywin was smart enough not to actually claim lordship of Harrenhal for himself. He used it as a military asset and then left. After Tywin marched south following the Battle of the Blackwater, control of Harrenhal became confused and contested. Arya Stark served there briefly as a servant while it was under Lannister control, an extraordinary situation given that she was the daughter of the man who had most recently been Lord of Harrenhal before his execution. The castle held the ghost of her family's brief tenure in the very walls she was cleaning. Jaqen H'ghar killed for Arya in that castle, and the chaos that followed allowed the Brave Companions, a mercenary company also called the Bloody Mummers, to briefly hold the place. They tortured and mutilated prisoners there, adding more blood to the castle's already soaked history. When they were cleared out, Sir Roose Bolton took control and used it as his headquarters in the Riverlands before eventually betraying Robb Stark at the Red Wedding. The Red Wedding itself was partially planned in the halls of Harrenhal. The greatest mass murder of the entire War of Five Kings, the slaughter that ended Robb Stark's rebellion and killed the young wolf, had Harrenhal as part of its background and planning. The castle contributed to another catastrophe, without even being the location where that catastrophe occurred. By the end of the main series events, Harrenhal sits largely empty again. Littlefinger was granted the castle and lands by Joffrey as a reward for brokering the Tyrell alliance, technically making Petyr Baelish the Lord of Harrenhal and one of the most powerful men in the Riverlands on paper. In practice, he has almost no one there, and the castle continues to be a ruin that has killed or destroyed everyone who tried to hold it properly. So there you have it. 8 houses that tried to rule Harrenhal, and 8 houses that were destroyed, diminished, or corrupted for trying. From Harren the Black, who burned alive on the night he finished building it, to the Whents who hosted the tournament that ended a dynasty, to the revolving door of claimants during the War of Five Kings, the castle has a perfect record of destroying its lord. What makes the Harrenhal curse compelling beyond the individual tragedies is what it says about the nature of power in Westeros. The castle looks like the greatest prize in the Riverlands. It is unquestionably the most impressive structure in the region, and one of the most imposing in the world. Whoever holds it commands the God's Eye, controls river crossings, and projects an image of total dominance. The size alone communicates something that no other castle in Westeros can match. But size is also the problem. Harrenhal is too big to garrison properly, too big to maintain without extraordinary wealth, too prestigious to hold without attracting every ambitious and dangerous eye in the kingdom. The very qualities that make it seem like the ultimate prize make it functionally impossible to hold. You need armies to fill it. You need fortunes to maintain it. You need political insulation that nobody really has in Westeros' brutal game of houses. There's also something that feels genuinely supernatural about Harrenhal, beyond the practical difficulty. The concentration of death in that place, from Harren slaves worked to death in the foundations, to the Hoare family burned alive in the towers, to the centuries of violence and torture and murder that followed, creates a location that seems to carry its history in its very stone. The warped and fused towers that still bend from Valyrian's fire are a constant visual reminder that this is a place where the most powerful force in the world's history came and destroyed everything. The families that held it longest were the ones who used it as a tool rather than a home. Tywin Lannister, perhaps the most politically intelligent lord of his generation, was smart enough to use Harrenhal as a base camp and leave. He didn't try to make it his seat, didn't try to claim lordship of it for House Lannister, didn't let his family get attached to it. He understood intuitively what generations of lesser lords had to learn through extinction. You can visit Harrenhal. You probably shouldn't try to live there. The most haunting thing about the Harrenhal story is that it continues. Littlefinger technically holds it right now in the main series timeline, and Littlefinger has been one of the most dangerous operators in the entire political game. Whether the castle's curse will catch up with him the way it caught up with everyone else remains to be seen. But the pattern of 8 houses and 8 destructions suggests that the odds are not in his favor. Harrenhal is Westeros' most perfect monument to hubris. Harren built it to be eternal, and it killed him immediately. Every house that tried to make it theirs found the castle was bigger than their ambition, their resources, or their luck could sustain. The blackened towers stand today as a reminder that in Westeros, the biggest prize can be the deadliest trap. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the cursed history of Harrenhal and the houses that tried to rule it, hit that like button and subscribe for more lore videos covering the history and politics of Westeros. Drop a comment letting me know which Harrenhal lord you found most interesting, or whether you think the curse is real or just a string of coincidences. There is a lot more history in this world worth covering.